Welcome to a series of 5 lectures on American exceptionalism and American identity, delivered at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in Eugene, Oregon, in January and February of 2019. Here we are again. This is going to be a little bit different this time. You'll see that it's a little more abstract, in that sense a little easier, or another way a little harder. But what we're heading for is this. Today we're looking at formal, should be an R in there, right? Formal selves and identities. 4 and 5 will apply the stuff to the US in more concrete detail. Americans claim to be exceptionally exceptional. The only new game in town. By the way, in the latest issue of the New York Review of Books, there's a review of 2 books on American exceptionalism and American empire, which basically says that the claim to America's special is just a cover for standard old imperialism. And that's largely true. But I'm arguing it isn't completely true, that there is something special that we have to look at, and it has to do with the stuff about modernization. I remind you that there's various readings available at dcolb.org. You go down about 2 inches on the page, you'll see a link to them, and I keep putting more stuff on there. Okay. So we're the new people, we're the free people, we're the new kinds of people. We're the heirs of the Enlightenment, we're modern. What does that mean? We use the terms from Max Weber, substantive and formal rationality, as a way to give some substance to this newness. Weber claimed there's 2 what he called ideal types, which means you don't ever see them in their purity. Substantive, which is like somebody living in a tribe, compound, the architecture, the layout of the house, the sex roles, the gender, the hierarchy of the society are all given by nature, told him by God. You just take it as the only way to live. It defines who we are, it defines what we can become. That's what he means by substantive. It's got content. And in the last week, I argued that there really never could be something quite like that, because there's always a kind of inner distance, which you have to have in order to be conscious of having a role. And nonetheless, that inner distance, in many historical cases, though it tells us what we are, you can still wonder, gee, I wonder if that's the way to be. But there's no way for you to actualize that wondering. There's no place in the society to bring that up without looking weird. So that's what I was doing last week, was saying, to claim that our identities are single ply is wrong, because in fact our identities are always a little bit volatilized. And today we're going to look at the other side, that modern freedom is a nice, pure, empty, formal freedom. Well, this is what we did last week. I took a bunch of these oppositions between formal and substantive rationality or society. Some are positive on one side, some are positive on the other side. Choking versus liberated. On the other hand, home versus homeless. And depending on how you want your rhetoric to go, you take the ones that are negative on the side you want to condemn and push the other side. And I'm saying that this gives you a very convenient way to define things, but it's not right. It's not right because neither of these sides exist the way they are in their purity. And if you take a substance, you're just talking about, it's just there. I mean, it's a diamond. What can you do with a diamond? You can't change its DNA. It doesn't have any. Diamond is just a diamond, right? The social role of being a plumber is just being a plumber. But you can change that. And the argument that I gave you last week was roughly, we don't have identities the way a stone has its weight. Just there, just defining it, right? The value or role isn't in us the way that the color is in the rock, or the shape of the board is in the wood here. Right? We're not in a culture the way a stone is in a pile. Right? And then we talked about Achilles, the standard Homeric hero example, which is as sort of close as you can come to that. You can't imagine Achilles saying, you know, I'm just a warrior 9 to 5. You know, I go home, I'm quite a different guy. I have a private life. No, he's a warrior, that's all there is to it. And what he does in his private life is secondary, it's not his real identity. We say that, right? And then we looked at a bunch of examples. We took Antigone and Ismene from the Sophocles play Antigone, where the two social roles, daughter and citizen, have come into conflict. And they had to choose between them. The very fact that they have to choose means that there's now some inner distance, some friction between the roles. They don't fit either of them the way we imagine Achilles fitting his role. Then we talked about Socrates, who's walking around actually telling people, oh, you know, that's a good role. You think the society is really set up right? Maybe we should redefine justice. You know, asking questions that prompt you to make more distance between yourself and your roles. And then I used the example of St. Paul, who got caught between two communities, the traditional Jews and the Christian Gentiles. He was being attacked, he was being accused. He appealed to Rome because he was a Roman citizen, which is to say, being a Roman citizen provided a sort of second-level identity, which wasn't like being from one city or another city, or one ethnic group or another ethnic group, but it was sort of above them. It was still contentful, it wasn't purely formal, but it had a generality that the others didn't. So he could appeal to it for legal purposes. Then we talked a little bit about the Enlightenment battle against superstition, which Hegel makes the point that we got these Voltaire fighting against the superstitious people, and the superstitious people having to defend themselves against Voltaire, and people like Bossuet writing defenses of religion. Each of those people has to become more self-conscious about their role because they're being attacked. Again, it's like the conflict between them in Antigone. Because of the dialogue, because of the defense, there's now more inner distance, more complicated relationships between your belief, your role, and yourself. And then we made some reference to the German Romantic poets, who were Hegel's contemporaries, who were producing extremely ironic, distanced, floating subjects. Well, I'm above it all, I'm looking down. Nonetheless, they're still German. They're still starting from somewhere, right? I made some references to Samarkand and those places in the Protestant Reformation. So when you go through all of that, you're left with the idea that this division between the purely given and the empty and insubstantial is very questionable. We've been questioning it from the side of immediately given. We're saying what's immediately given and solid doesn't look quite so solid. The Romantic ironists did have a lot of immediately given values and roles. They may have rejected them or questioned them, but they started from them. But they were also at a distance from them. So my suggestion at the end of the last class was, there is no single ply immediate identity. Everything is mediated. There's not even just two levels. It's not just I'm a firm believer and I'm reflecting on it. Each side infects the other. So that there's distances and spacings and reflections going on. And that's the atmosphere in which you have a role. Now, that atmosphere may not be very pronounced, and society may not encourage it, but it's there. And the philosophers who studied it argue in various different ways, oh, it has to do with the way we live in time. When something is present in time, it's present against a horizon of future possibilities, which opens a space for its change. Or we have symbol systems of meanings that work by contrast, which it can't be controlled, which makes space for change. Or you can talk about it in terms of the nature of action. Those are different fundamental ways of trying to explain it. And you could argue which one is first, but that doesn't matter. The basic point is there is this internal distance. So that at the end of the session, I argued there never was Achilles as a pure single-ply fixed identity. There were always internal movements and distances, but they had no way to be realized. If you felt them, you just felt funny. You were kind of weird. You made jokes about it. You thought that maybe there was something wrong with you. But it was there. And what's happened gradually over time is we have developed ways to take those inner distances, motions, self-reflections, and the like, and give them a place in society. Oh, you want to be a critic? You want to question our roles? Good. We'll let you write for the New York Times, right? Or something like that. So there's a way to put those inner reflections and distances to work. You might also say to civilize them. You might even say to tame them. Which is why Nietzsche didn't like that. So, all of that was a way of saying that in the last lecture, we dealt with the illusion that identities are signal-ply. We liquefied them, or fragmented them, or fractured them by making an inner distance and self-reflection a component of any identity. And then argued that history got us to have more recognized places and roles for them, and that's a big change. Okay, that's half of the task. The other task today is that we have to get to say, well, wait a minute. People still say, who are you, really? Come on. Here's the box. There are 3 sexual identities, 4 ethnic identities. You're either pro or anti-communist. Choose, right? As if you had to label yourself with one and only one label. Right? Or we worry, even now, that inner distance, irony, self-reflection is going to leave us feeling, oh, I don't want to feel that way because I won't know what to do. There'll be nowhere to go. Maybe we'll be lost in space. You know, everything will be blah, everything will be, oh, what do I do? If I don't have a solid identity, I have nothing. Right? So that's the other side. I've argued that there isn't any completely solid identity. Now we have to get rid of the nothing. Right? So it's time to dispel the second illusion, that with modern freedom, we become pure form without content. No way to turn, always equally blah. Right? Okay, let's talk about pure form. Here's a form, right? Fill it in. It's waving. It's a certain amount of organization there. I mean, it's a form about addresses and whatnot. But there's no content except what's implicit in the organization. We could imagine a self like that, or a society like that. Purely empty formal self. I receive data. I consult my preferences. I decide on a plan, and I execute my plan. What is it? It all depends what the data is, you know, what the preferences are. But the machine here is purely formal. It's not empty. It does have a form, but there's no content in that form. Here's another way to put it. You experience, you do something, you reflect on it, you theorize about it, you experiment with that, and you go the cycle again, right? That's a machine, that's a form, that's what we do, right? But this content is going to be supplied by what we experience. Now I have a footnote here. What you see on the screen is the Kolb cycle of experiential learning. That's not me. That's this guy. David A. Kolb, born in 1939. I get emails from him twice a week. People call me saying, can I use your forms, because he sells a lot of stuff. And I've talked with him. I said, what are we going to do? Because my name is David A. Kolb, too. And I was born in 1939. And where A is Alan in both cases, although he spells it differently. I think I'm a month or two older, but I'm not sure. we've talked about it because Amazon and Google can't tell us apart. If you look at one of my books on Amazon, they'll say, other books by David Colvin, they'll list his. Now, he's written way more books, but if you look at his list, you'll find one of mine. So it's confusing, it's fun. He did a great thing. He took one of my books on Hegel and Heidegger and put it on his coffee table. He said it was a great conversation piece. And Anne will tell you she's worked with his psychological testing material in her own work, which was a very strange experience. So that's a footnote, but it's a fun one. Just this week, somebody on Twitter contacted me and said, I found you at last. Could you really tell me more about your... And I had to write back and say, sorry. Here's his website, go talk to him. All right. So you could imagine a formal description of the self like that, which just simply open for whatever preferences get plugged in, whatever data gets plugged in. That's a description of an empty self. Here's a description of an empty society. We gather data on the individual preferences. We poll people or something like that. We derive a group preference from it, and then we implement that. And we have feedback loops. Same basic formula, right? And obviously, that's hiding a lot because what does it mean to derive a group preference? Well, that could be a legislature. It could be a debate. It could be a market mechanism. There's all sorts of ways to integrate individual preferences into a group preference. Economic, political, and the whole problem of society in a way is to figure out what goes in that middle box, right? So those are formal descriptions, and you could fill it out. You could say, well, here's a formal description of a market system. Here's a formal description of a bicameral legislature. Here's a formal description of what we call game theoretical decision procedures, right? You could do a lot of that, and it would be purely formal. And it would be purely formal in this technical sense. There'd be no substantive goals. There would not be like a footnote saying, you must preserve the royal family, or you must strengthen the established church, or you cannot disturb the natural ranks of honor and income and subordination. Right? That would put a contentful bias on the purely formal thing. Right? So that's what I mean by a formal description of society. And of course, there could be degrees of formality. And the higher ones, you just say something like decision procedures, isn't much help. But you could implement it in various ways. And the issue would be, when does it begin to acquire content? Well, here's the first point. We have a guest appearance now by bureaucracy, because this is what implements a formal process. Now, bureaucracy is an interesting term. It's a French word. Originally meant a small room, a small desk. There you are, bureaucracy. Max Weber, our friend from the first lecture, had a theory about the nature of bureaucracy. He said, a bureaucracy has got to be something which works according to rules and standard operating procedures. The people who are selected because they have the qualifications, not because they're somebody's nephew. Right? Positions are organized with a hierarchy, with a clear chain of command. The jobs are simple, broken down. The people are professionals, they don't own it, and there's a uniform application of rules. That's, of course, the most important thing. Right? So that makes for efficiency. It makes for impersonality. You won't be biased by the fact that I'm the nephew of the person who appointed me. And you won't be afraid that because you're a woman or 32 or Jewish or Italian, you'll have that trouble because we treat everybody the same, right? Supposedly. So that's what a good bureaucracy would be like, says Weber. But Weber also says it's not so good because it's impersonal, it's going to lead to a kind of icy, cold, inhuman way of dealing with people. Still, it describes a well-functioning machine waiting for content. Could you set up a whole society that way? You might imagine it as a libertarian dream. Right? We have this bureaucracy ready to go, but all the direction will come from those creative entrepreneurial individuals. Well, there's an issue of who provides the content. And there's issues of whether the institutions are neutral, and one can make criticisms along those lines. But I want to raise a different question, a deeper problem with the bureaucracy, which we need it for our purposes. Let's suppose you're a bureaucrat. Cases come up before you. They could be in a form, could be an applicant, you work for Social Security or whatever. And then you have rules, right? If the case has qualities A, B, and C, you handle it by this method. If the case has qualities D, E, and F, you handle it by this other method. Now a problem comes up. Sometimes a case will be different in unexpected ways, right? I'll give you an example from my own experience. I was in a situation where I wanted to make a trip, but I had to get permission from a boss. And the boss said, you can't do that because if I gave you permission to do that, I'd have to give everybody permission to do that. And I said, no, but my case is different. And he said, I don't see where the difference is. And I explained the situation. He said, that's not a relevant difference. But it was. Right? So that's the kind of thing that happens. There's something outside the rule which you think is relevant to the rule and should be considered, and the people manipulating the rules are not so sure about that. That happens more than you would think, right? It's not fair. It's the rule. The rule is wrong. Well, what do you do then? The problem is this. You can't guarantee from a rule that it will work in all cases. Right? Okay, let's make more rules. Right? Finer grained, more elaborate rules. But there's no rule for picking out the cases where the original rule fails. They can be surprising. They might be something no one who made the rules has ever considered before. Right? No general description of an individual or an individual case can capture all of the detail that belong to that case or individual. And there's no rule stating which of those infinite details are relevant to the decision. Right? You can't guarantee that your rules, however fine-grained they are, haven't left out one of the other infinite bits of details, which in this case, surprise, are relevant. Right? Formal general procedures need supplementation. Aristotle made this point. Practical wisdom, that's his phrase. Perceive the individual case correctly. Aristotle said, suppose you're trying to decide who to marry, what career to pursue. You want some advice. Who do you go to? You go to somebody who you think has a certain kind of practical knack for making decisions. And he says what that really means is someone who can figure out what is relevant to the decision. It may not occur to you that it's relevant that this one job is in some city that you wouldn't like. Thomas Aquinas puts it the other way. He says, the man of practical wisdom is the person who knows when to stop bringing relevant things in, when there's been enough relevant things. The same idea. Who knows what's relevant or what isn't. Right? So that's a skill. There's no rule for that. To put it this way, we're finding a certain substantive problem with a formal system. Any formal system is going to run into the fact that however elaborately you define the system, there's going to be cases where those rules will be challenged and questioned, right? Which builds in a certain kind of inner friction and distance into the formal system. A way to put it that Wittgenstein puts it this way, there is no rule about applying rules. If I said to you, I don't know how to apply this rule, you said, oh, that's right, I have this meta rule. You use that to decide how to apply the first rule. And I say, well, how do I apply the meta rule? Oh, we have a meta rule for that. Oh, well, there's another meta rule, etc. You get an infinite regress. At some point, you're going to just make a decision based on perception, practical wisdom, or something like that. Which is to say the system of rules, the formal description of the system, can never be complete. Now, that's the first point. Bureaucracy makes us see that a formal description of a system always leaves something out. It has to be supplemented. Second point, a guest appearance by capitalism. Why bring in capitalism? This is a bit of an aside, but it's all right. We tend to assume that a formally free universal system means a free market. May or may not, but that is an assumption. People tend to assume that a free market equals capitalism. That's even more questionable. There could be other kinds of free market. And there's a tendency to think that Weber's totally formally free modern individual means the capitalist economic man, the person who, taking whatever the decision is into account, says, these are my preferences. The utilities of these 5 choices measure this way and choose that. Marginal productivity or something like that. And in each case, what's happening there is that something that looks like a formally free system is being tied into a particular system. Remember Rostow's diagram, which presumed that to go from a traditional society to a modern society meant to go from some kind of restrained economic circulation to capitalist international commodity circulation. That that's equivalent, but they may not be. Right? Homo economicus, the idea that the only thing you think about is balancing your own private utility function of what satisfies your preferences, and you let the invisible hand take care of everything else. That's had a lot of critique from what's nowadays called behavioral economics, that people don't work that way. There's some references I put on the reading sheet. And capitalism is one way to arrange property relations, but it's actually not as free as it appears to be. I'll say a word about that. But what I'm saying is there's some hidden substantive presuppositions here. Here's the usual American image. Right? I found this on the web. Now, the mistake in this image is twofold. Socialism doesn't have to mean that, and capitalism doesn't mean we walk hand in hand, the capitalists and the laborers. There is some friction there. Right? For instance, you come to the free market, us capitalists, you laborers, we aren't equal. I own the stuff. You don't. You have to get a job from me. Right? You sell me your power, your labor, which I need it, so that's all right. But we're bargaining from a different position. And more fundamentally, there's this. You can't not come to the market. I mean, in the old days, when everybody had their own little farm, or in the new days when some people dream of a green situation where everybody is self-sufficient, off the grid and all that, then you don't need the market except for luxuries. Right? You've got your basic subsistence on your own hand. You don't need to go to the market to live. But in a capitalist society you do, because everything is available in the market and you no longer have the tools to produce stuff on your own. Right? And you'll notice that this image of the future green society where everybody is free to do what they want, and the earlier society, they sort of converge. Right? So another problem is the tendency of capitalism to produce monopolies. You can argue how tight that is or not. And then there's always the issue of not looking at the men behind the curtain. So that is to say there's some non-formal features of what is supposedly is a purely formal economic system. Now those are all legitimate complaints that need to be discussed about capitalism or any economic system. But that's actually not what I want to talk about. Because as with bureaucracy, there's a deeper fundamental issue here that needs to be pointed out, which is that any purely formal social mechanism cannot exist as such, as purely open and formal. Right? So that's what I want to talk about now. I have two arguments to convince you of this. One comes from Wittgenstein. It's about machines. And one is from Hegel, and it's about animals. Right? So what we're trying to prove here is that any formal system, my description of a bureaucracy, my description of a free market, a formula for a bicameral legislature, cannot exist the way they are described. Here's Wittgenstein. This is actually from a book he wrote about mathematics, and the point is making a point about mathematical proofs, but we don't have to worry about that. Here's his example of a machine. It's a more complicated example than it needs to be. But imagine this. You're turning the wheel. As you pull the A point around the circle, the B point will be pulled in and out and will make a figure 8. As the wheel turns, the point on the other end will make that pattern. Here's some easier diagrams. A teeter-totter, right? You push on one end, the other end goes up, right? You let it go, it goes down. Or levers. Pull the handle, the nail comes up. Right? Lift the handle, the weight on the wheelbarrow comes up. Flip this, and you can handle the weight on the fly rod. Right? Actually, that's a spinning rod, isn't it? Anyway, the point is, we're all familiar with diagrams of machines. We use them all the time. You say, oh, I see. You turn this and then that moves. Or you pull this lever and then that gear is released and it goes around, 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 and so on. We do that all the time. Now, Wittgenstein is making a point about those diagrams. This is a quote. When I see the picture of the mechanism, that can tell me how a part actually will move. Though, if the picture represented a mechanism whose parts were composed of very soft material, dough, say, and hence bent about in various ways, the picture would not help in making a prediction. So the picture is making certain presuppositions about what material the machine is composed of. Well, so what? Well, let's generalize that. What's formally described in a machine depends on what it's made out of. Well, of course. The lawnmower made of silly putty wouldn't work. No? The diagram says what the motions will be, only if it's not made of dough or rubber or silly putty or something like that. Well, then we have to clarify the situation. We have to say the diagram will show what the machine will do, provided that the material has the following qualities. Right? So we need a rule that specifies all the relevant qualities. We're back to the same problems with bureaucracy. Right? It may not occur to us, for instance, as a relevant quality that the machine has to work within a temperature range, or below the speed of light, or what have you. Right? Just as you can't, for a bureaucrat, specify all the possible qualities that the rule is to help you divide cases by, here too, there will be qualities of the material that in weird cases might be relevant to the functioning of the machine. And there's no rule that will give you all of those qualities. We just learned you can't get that. Right? Ah, you thought engineering was easy. Right? Engineering is where the rubber hits the road, quite literally. Engineering is the person who stands there saying, okay, I've got the theory, I've got the physics, I've got the design for the machine. I've got to find what will produce a machine that will work. What's the temperature range? How long do you want it to work without repair? What kind of materials are available? I mean, the engineer has to do that. The architect has to do that in planning a house. Okay, I've got a lovely plan for the house. What kind of columns will support it? For how long? At what temperatures? And so on. Right? In other words, when you get down to bringing a formal description into reality, there's going to be all sorts of things you have to think about. And there's no firm exhaustive, absolutely reliable rules telling you when you've thought enough about them. It's always something of a gamble because there may be things, whoever knew that the magnetic properties of the thing could be affecting it, or they're related to the motion of Mars somehow, who knows. In any case, the same point I was making about bureaucracy comes up here. There's no rule. You're going to have to introduce perception, experience, judgment, content, materiality, substance into the purely formal thing, just to make it work at all. Now that's nice to talk about machines, but look, it applies to society too. That's the point that I want to make. A social machine, a market, a legislature, a committee structure, a bureaucracy, also will depend on the people, the climate, the resources that it's made out of. Right? And there may be, again, qualities which will cause it to function or malfunction that you haven't thought about. Cases where you realize it isn't going to work, or that it will work differently than you thought. Right? Here's an example of flows of capital. Every arrow in that nice, clean, formal diagram would have to be implemented using real people under certain circumstances, speaking certain languages, right? With certain customs and certain histories. So the way that they were would affect the way it worked. Right? Ditto here. Here's a standard US Constitution picture. But we know it's behaved differently depending on different people. Or you could say this: how a system is embodied, because a formal system is just an abstract diagram, how it's embodied determines, opens, creates, restricts its possibility. I'll come back to that another point in a minute. So let's imagine you had 15 nations that used the same constitution. They wouldn't be identical because one would have a different history, one would have a different way of making informal decisions, one would have a different time frame. I mean, we don't know what those things that would make the differences are, but they would be there. Right? Hegel, in fact, had this idea, which was wrong, but that we had achieved a pretty clear idea of what the final rational constitution would be. Roughly speaking, a constitutional monarchy, a bicameral legislature, bureaucracy, and whatnot. And so he imagined that all modern states would have the same constitution. But he said they would still be not like the same, because each would have a different, what he called, national spirit. The French would still be French, the Austrians would be Austrians, the Germans would be Germans, Russians would be themselves. Now, I think he's wrong. That is, the units he's talking about are too big. Yeah, the French are still going to be French, but there's 15 different kinds of French people. So there's an issue about what size of groups would have these, quote, national spirits. But his point is correct. Even though they shared the same formal description of their constitution, they wouldn't embody it in quite the same way. And you would find, even though the description was the same, that the committees in Germany and the committees in America didn't act the same. Right? Okay, that's the end of the Wittgenstein thing. Now we're going to go on to Hegel. Now it's 1:15. We started a little late. So I'm going to go through some of this Hegel stuff and then we'll take a break. Is that okay? Hegel's thinking about animals. Well, ever since Aristotle, you've defined an animal as being an organism, individual organism, which is capable of mobility, it's not a plant, reproduction, nutrition, it can take in stuff from the environment, right? And irritability is the phrase they often use. It can react to what's going on around it. Well, one of those features is mobility. Animals have to be mobile. But how are they mobile? Some animals have feet, some don't. Some creep, some crawl, some fly. You could have legs or wings or fins, or you could imagine animals with treads, you know. How many appendages they have, their function, their number, that's not specified when you say mobility. There's a lot of detail there that's been left out. Right? So maybe it walks, or it slithers, or it glides, or it swims, or it flies and flops, or burrows, or runs, or jumps. Each of those is going to produce a different kind of animal. It might walk on feet, or hoofs, or pads, or 2 legs, or 4 legs, or 100 legs. Putting in that detail isn't just detail. It determines how the animal can walk. It determines whether it's got wide feet or soft feet. It's going to allow certain kind of movements and not others. The little dog can't jump the way the kangaroo can jump. The kangaroo can't get as close to the ground as the little dog can get. The bird can go things, of course, that the bear can't. The bear can go through the woods in one way and the mouse can go through it in a different way, which means that the environment for the animals is going to be quite different. The possible actions they can do is going to be quite different, just because they have different kinds of feet. Now, of course, the feet have been chosen by evolution and to do that. But the point is, each choice favors certain environments and not others. Its legs will have a certain tensile strength. Its feet will be just so big or have a different kinds of clothes. When you specify those details, you're specifying a whole raft of environmental issues, a whole set of abilities or not abilities. And you can see the parallel here. Take a social system, depending how you further specify it, different things are going to be possible or impossible. Right. Tigers. It's not that a tiger is mobile and has legs. It's that a tiger is mobile through having legs of a certain kind, just as it's colored through having stripes. A particular identity opens possibilities. Given that it has stripes, it can move through the jungle and be harder to see. Given that it has certain kind of feet, it can do certain things. It also limits its possibilities. Given stripes, it can't very well be out in the open too much and be too visible. Given its feet, it can't climb trees very well. So there's a repertoire of skills and instincts and reactions and sensitivities that fit it into its Umwelt, its environment. For the animal to be able to move, all of these details have to be realized. To be mobile is to be mobile in a particular way, giving a purchase in a particular environment, enabling motions of a specific kind. This screen you see on the bottom is from Nanzenji Temple in Kyoto. The Japanese had never seen tigers. They didn't really know what they looked like. So this is what they were painting. They'd heard about them from China. Their pictures are all wrong, but they're kind of fun. Right? All right, I'm going to stop there. Think about this problem, but don't apply it to tigers. Apply it to a free market or a legislature, right? That any description you give, no matter how detailed, of the operating procedures for a certain social system will have to be embodied with much more contingent detail than your description gives it, because there's always more detail. And that will affect how it operates, what it can do, what it can't do. Which is a way of saying no purely formal self or system exists simply that way. It always has to have some starting point, some content, some embodiment, right? Which is going to narrow its possibilities as well as open its possibilities, both ways. Okay, let's take a break. Now remember, we started out with the idea that rules can never be guaranteed to cover all cases. But this is a related point. No matter how thoroughly you describe a system, it will always be embodied through or in contingent details, more details than you've designed for, which will open certain possibilities, certain styles of action, and close off others. It will never exist as a purely formally described, never able to do all the imagined possibilities. Contingent embodiment will shape and limit its capabilities. Kind of obvious. But that means that if you're talking about bureaucracy or capitalism or modern individualism and formally describe them in some way as sort of universal, they won't exist that way. They'll always exist. They're always starting from somewhere. They already have certain substantive qualifications. The formal system can't simply exist as a formal system. To put it into action at all is to make it out of certain materials, whether you're talking about a machine or you're talking about a social structure, certain people, certain materials. And those are going to open certain possibilities and close others. So, just as we said originally in the first lecture that you can't have a purely substantive thing without inner distance, here we're saying you can't have a purely formal floating system without some substance, or better, without some place to be, some embodiment which is going to both make it possible for it to act and limit that action. Conclusion: there's no formally free, pure, formal, modern individual. Conclusion: there is no formally free, pure, modern society. Right? Any identity, any social role, no matter how you define it, will only exist through or in or with contingent detail which will affect its operation. It will define its operation. It will open the possibilities and close other possibilities. Now, I want to make a point here. The easy way to try to get out of this would be to say, oh, well, yeah, sure. The system is empty and it's waiting for data. We put different data in and the system processes it. That's what we're talking about. No, we're talking about the process itself. How the system processes data. That too has to be embodied. You can't say, oh, different preferences will be put in and they'll be decided. They'll be decided by a committee made up of certain people. They'll be decided by people speaking a certain language in a certain culture with a certain history. Right? The style of processing, the way the rules will be followed, not just the stuff that the rules are talking about, but the way the rules will be followed, depends upon contingent details that may differ from place to place. Right? So we go back to that point. Even if everybody had the same written constitution, they wouldn't be acting in it the same way. Right? Now you add to this the point from last week that there's inner distance, self-reflection. The question is, how do we live this? I mean, look, we're in a situation where, all right, no matter how you try to define us formally, there's going to be some substantial place to start. There's going to be something you always already are before you start thinking. You don't start talking to yourself until you know a language. You don't start moving around until you have feet, and the feet are a certain kind. You don't start looking at the world until you have eyes or ears of a certain kind, right? So in order to do anything, you're already embodied, and that embodiment is contingent in ways that will open certain possibilities and close off others. So the formally free, universal doesn't happen that way. Well, how do you live that? Knowing that at the same time, you're sort of distant. Here I am. That's the way I start. I have these eyes. I have an Irish background. I was brought up Catholic. Can I just throw it all over? You can, but you're still starting from it. You can throw it all over, but the way you're going to move from it is different from the way you would have moved from being a Jewish background. Right? It's not like you can just ascend into emptiness. Right? So when I just get ironical and say, what the heck, you know. How do we live this strange situation, which is the situation of being a modern, which is we have places to start. We have things we already are before we had a chance. Again, quoting Peanuts, I didn't get a chance to fill out an application. Right? And how do I do that without trying to just turn into some sort of, oh, well, what the hell, ironic. Because that just leaves you empty. You don't have anything to do. I'm going to use a very strange example here. Fan fiction. What, you may ask, is fan fiction. You can go to fanfiction.net, all right, which is huge. Fan fiction is people who are interested in Jane Austen, or Star Wars, or Harry Potter, or Shakespeare. So much interested that they decide they're going to write their own. All right? Some authors like this, some don't. You know, some authors try to stop it, but it's hard to stop. So somebody really gets into, say, Star Wars, and he'd like to explore, well, what if Spock did this? What if Spock fell in love? What if they did this? What if this happened? What about it? They begin to sort of twiddle with the rules, right? Sometimes they're just filling in the details. Sometimes they're trying to twist the details. But there's a lot of it. Here's some examples. Novels. There's pages and pages of novels that are listed in the fan fiction index. Here's a few. Emma, Jane Austen's Emma. 368 short stories trying to do something with the plot of Emma. Great Gatsby, 361. Robin Hood, 343. Alexander, Hunchback of Notre Dame, 321. Clearly, there are people who find this interesting. They like the world, they want to live in it, they want to explore it a bit, they want to change it. Right? Plays. 3,500 people writing stuff about Les Miserables. Phantom of the Opera, 210. Book of Mormon, 342. There's a lot of people who have leisure time, it seems, but who are able to get into these worlds enough, enthusiastically enough, that they want to do something with them. Right? Movies. 6,500 people playing with Batman. Captain America, 7,000. Here, obviously, the hero movies, a lot of people want to play with. Now, there's also fan fiction about games and other things. I mean, the fan fiction site is enormous. And any one of these things probably has 2 pages of columns. So clearly, there's lots of people who are finding it interesting enough to delve into, some of them, of course, very badly done, but some might be very well done, delve into it enough to try and get into that world, explore it, modify it, change it. Now, one response could be, here's some examples. I just picked them at random. There's some Hamlet there, some Shakespeare stuff on the top, some Jane Austen stuff on the bottom. Right? And one's in French. Right? So, and they have different ratings. I don't know who rates them. This is a community of people who share their interests and share stuff back and forth. Right? So clearly, this is an attitude. What I'm interested in is the attitude. Right? Here's another example. These are Harry Potter people, right? All costumed up. Cosplay, they call it. Right? You're playing in a costume at a conference, maybe, or what have you. And of course, they know that he's not Harry Potter. You can identify the Potter characters there. But they want to do it. They're having fun. But there's something more going on here, because as they do it, they're modifying. Fan fiction authors are not creating out of thin air. They're in a history and a world. There may be an imagined one, but they're in it. And they're trying to fill it out. They want more. They want to meet Darcy. They want to be Harry Potter. They want to revise it. They want to have Potter not end up with, what's her name, but with Hermione instead, right? There's a self-conscious creation going on within rules and roles that are given and decreed, but not final. They're willing to creatively bend and amend them. Now, maybe they're doing it to escape the real world, right? But that's where we are. Right? We're really where they are. We have a set of, go back. We're doing self-conscious creation within rules and roles that are given and decreed, but not solidly final. We're creatively bending and amending them. That's our job with where we already are, right? So this fan fiction thing, which is a little bit crazy perhaps, speaking about an attitude which we should have toward our always already given roles and values, right? It's not an escape. It's where we're at. That's their way of inhabiting a world is what we need. So our job is to do it more creatively and more self-consciously. Right? And together, which is the hard part. Here's an example. This is a bunch of people who are doing Star Wars meeting a bunch of Civil War reenactors. Right? Well, that's where we are all at. We're running into collisions of different roles and worlds and so on. Right? This may sound strange, but that's our situation in our world. Right? So at the beginning I said we have to dispel the second illusion that modern freedom makes us into pure form without content. No way to turn, all ways are equally blah. And the key, I said, was we're never empty. We're always already somewhere. We're always involved. We're always moving in directions like the animal that already has a certain kind of feet. We have a certain language in a particular place with talents and directions we didn't choose, but that make us who we are. But the other key is there's always interdistance. There's always room to do what the enactors, the fan fiction people are doing. Bend the rules, twist them, move them around. The interdistance, the contingent facts, each exist by way of the other. Change and reform is always possible, not easy, but it never starts from zero. You're neither completely in a solid nor floating in thin air. You're always sort of in the middle, starting from somewhere with the distance and possibilities to change, though God knows it's hard to do once you have to do it together. Okay, that's the message for today. And basically, part of what that's saying is you can't start from zero. We're never empty. There's always interdistance. But some kinds of American exceptionalism say we are different because we do start from zero. We clear it all out. We're totally free. Oh? Next week, back to the USA. Okay. Time for questions.
Questions?
So what I've been trying to do in the last two lectures is eliminate those kind of issues so that when we come to talk about American identity, we won't feel straitjacketed into looking for something purely substantial or purely formal. And where the rubber will really hit the road is then once we say, well, what about multiculturalism? Because we're a society that has many identities, maybe in one person, but certainly in one society. How do they fit when where I'm starting from is different from where you're starting from, and where my group is different from your group, and yet we have to live together? And there you start thinking about the Roman example, and you say, well, the Roman Empire had different cities, quite different cultures in France or Arabia, and yet the being a Roman was something above it all. Could you be an Italian immigrant, a Hispanic, a Jew fleeing Russia, and yet there'd be something, American identity, sort of like the Roman citizenship, above, not purely formal, but how would you define something above that that you could all have allegiance to, right? And once you defined it, because it would have to have some content, there might be things that would be outside that boundary. So those are the things we're going to look at in the next two. What kind of American identity could there be? What kind of overarching American commitments could there be in a multicultural situation? And where would the limits of that be? So, stay tuned.